Lastly, you'll absolutely want to dig into tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of the author's book. Use the link in the chat below to get your copy through Boldtype Books. Elena Conis is a writer and historian of medicine, public health, and the environment. She teaches at the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and the Media Studies program, and directs the graduate program in public journalism. Her current research focuses on scientific controversies, science denial, and the public understanding of science, and has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Institutes of Health, National Library of Medicine, and the Science History Institute. Her first book, Vaccine Nation, America's Changing Relationship with Immunization, received the Arthur J. Weisseltier Award from the American Public Health Association and was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title and a Science Pick of the Week by the journal Nature. Sally James is a writer and journalist who covers science and medical research. She has written for the Seattle Times, South Seattle Emerald, Seattle Magazine, and UW Magazine, among others. For the Emerald, she has been focusing during the pandemic on stories about health and access for communities of color. In the past, she has been a leader and volunteer for the nonprofit Northwest Science Writers Association. For many years, she was a reviewer for Health News Review, fact-checking national press reporting for accuracy and fairness. Please join me in welcoming Elena Conis and Sally James.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to start by thanking you, Elena, for opening yourself up to these questions tonight. And I'm especially interested for our readers who may not have already purchased the book in the cover image of the book. And I want to ask if we can have that image for the audience to look at.
And then US scientists were testing it during the war effort to see whether it would be useful for US troops in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, everywhere that they were serving. And what the US scientists found was that this chemical was incredibly effective at killing a really long list of bugs, including bugs that transmitted diseases among soldiers. And these included things that were just maybe more inconveniences than diseases, like bed bugs. And it also killed mosquitoes that transmitted things like malaria, dengue, yellow fever. The US Army decided to use this chemical DDT far and wide, and they sprayed it all over Army barracks. They sprayed it on troops. In liberated cities, they sprayed entire populations with it. And they really talked up how it helped win the war. One of the things that the US Army did was bomb entire islands with it in the Pacific to clear them of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And the news during the war would carry images of these rigged bombers that were unloading DDT from the air on these islands. One of the other ways that DDT was sprayed in the war was by hand on the ground. And after the war, there was a company that had grown tremendously during the war through war contracts, and it made smoke screens, machines that kind of rolled through, created smokes to cover the movements of Allied troops. And after the war, this company, TIFA was their name, TIFA, they were looking for a new market for their smoke screens. And so we are getting to the model. I know it seems like we're really far from the model, but we're getting to the model. This company said, what if we take a couple of things, put them together, and put DDT in our smokescreen machine and use it to spray American cities? They figured that it was kind of a long shot, and they ended up finding some really interesting ways of convincing US cities to spray themselves with DDT using these smokescreen machines. But one of the things they did was run, we would call them ads, but at the time they looked like articles. We might call them today sponsored content. It was articles that TIFA wrote and then supplied their own images for, and then ran in magazines like Life and Time and elsewhere. So in this 1948 issue of Life magazine, there was this article produced by TIFA for readers to understand why it could be helpful for them to spray their communities with DDT using one of their smoke screens. And this image, the cover image, is one of like 5 images attached to this article. And it's the raciest one. It's also the last one. Most of them were actually pretty mundane. They were showing the smoke screen kind of rolling across a beach or parked outside a suburban home, fogging the entire lawn and all the trees and shrubs with this DDT mist. And then the very last image is this image of this woman, and it says in the caption, Model K Heffernan sprayed with DDT. I think it was on Jones Beach. So when I saw this image, at first I wasn't that interested in it because it seemed like kind of an odd thing. Like, why include this picture of this woman in a bathing suit? And if you look at her closely, which if you have a copy of the book is easy to do, there are things about her. She's got like perfectly coiffed hair, a lot of jewelry, like lots of kind of bling on her fingers. And yes, she's eating this hamburger, she's sipping this Coke, and she's in this cloud of DDT. And my read of it was that this was Tifa's kind of like last ditch effort at the end of this article. Like, okay, if you're not convinced that it's going to make the beach more pleasant or your suburban neighborhood more pleasant, maybe you're convinced that, it's just going to attract your attention because of this, racy model who's surrounded by this mist. I have to admit, when I first saw the cover, I was really skeptical about the decision to use it on the cover of this book, a book that, in which I was telling the story of this quote unquote wonder chemical, why we began to use it, why we rejected it, and who was behind this move to bring it back. And this image initially seemed like a distraction to me. And part of what bothered me about it was that it was doing what it was meant to do at the time, using the female form, using, sex and celebrity, the idea that she was a model, to kind of sell us on something. And as I looked at the image more, and I went and I dug up the original image in its original context, and also the original image that the photographer had taken, which is even racier, if you can imagine it, because the bathing suit that she's wearing actually has breast darts. And so her physique is even sort of more pronounced than the original non-airbrushed version. And as I looked at it, I started to just feel sort of haunted by it, because one of the things that I knew in tracing the history of DDT was that decades later, scientists studying the chemical would realize that women who were exposed to high amounts of DDT when they were young, like young girl, late childhood, early teenage years, then faced an increased risk of breast cancer later in life. And not only that, there were intergenerational risks too, that their children and then their grandchildren or granddaughters in particular faced increased risks, not only of breast cancer, but of risk factors associated with the disease. And so suddenly this image meant a lot more to me. That's a kind of long answer to that question.
Well, let me just, excuse me, just making sure. DDT is an endocrine disruptor.
It is, yeah.
And some people in our audience may be familiar with that phrase, even though they may associate that phrase with phthalates or other chemicals that have been in headlines. So I want to ask you another question. The book sort of has 3 acts, the sort of promotion and boosterism, and then the kind of regulation, the beginning of people questioning. And for me, chapter 9 is a crucial chapter when actually hearings begin on pesticides in general. And I want to bring attention to a phrase you used. You called it a fundamental fracture in the way the FDA, the CDC, and USDA all had some hand in regulating chemicals. but you describe how, because they use different lenses with which to see them, and they use different, literally different lab techniques, the data really wasn't easily interchanged and exchanged between them. And you said it hindered public understanding, and I wonder if you could just describe a little of that bureaucratic problem.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. And it ties back to a little bit of what I was talking about before, because we tested this chemical in the context of war. USDA scientists tested extensively. FDA scientists tested at the same time, and this was in the 1940s. And they came to pretty different conclusions. The USDA scientists were like, it kills bugs. Great. They sprayed it in larger environments, and they were like, oh, it seems to kill some other stuff. That's a little troubling. Let's go back next week and see how the environment looks. Okay, it looks okay. The fish came back, the birds came back. The FDA scientists, meanwhile, were administering it in the lab to lab animals, and they were administering really high doses. They wanted to see how high a dose would actually harm an animal. And among these scientists at the FDA were some who noticed early on that the chemical was actually accumulating in the milk, the breast milk of animals, and then being passed, in one case, to their pups, in the case of an experiment using dogs. So we had these different groups of scientists kind of moving in really different directions, studying it in different ways and noticing different things about it. Each of them with their own respective responsibility for understanding pesticide risks and safety, but with kind of different pull over the process. And this fracture really exists throughout the 40s, throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s. And in the 1950s, our federal government held hearings on chemicals in food, which included pesticides. And some of these cracks in our regulatory infrastructure started to show. One of the solutions that we came up with in the 1950s was an amendment to the Food and Drug Law, which said, okay, hold on, let's do this. If there is any chemical that's shown to cause something really serious in animals, let's not allow it in the food supply. And the really serious thing was cancer. And so we left the 1950s with at least this moderate change. Well, actually, at the time, it was a significant change in how we were regulating chemicals. Then in the early 60s, Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring, and this throws chemical and, again, particularly pesticide regulation into question even more. And at this point, we have a whole host of interventions around this, both at the state level and the federal level. President Kennedy asks for an investigation, and Congress pursues their own investigations, and everybody's again thinking about how is it that we can prevent the kind of harm that Carson is describing in Silent Spring, which, for viewers who haven't read it, she focuses heavily on the harm to wildlife and ecosystems, but also talks about the potential harm to people and their long-term health in particular. So by the end of the 60s, there are folks pressing for just outright bans on these chemicals, including a ban on DDT. And I don't want to get too far ahead of us, but some of these folks are pressing for this at the state level. Later on, they take the fight to the federal level. And at the state level, they start to make some progress in the late 60s. But yeah, your question was about science, and we still haven't solved that problem by the late 60s.
Well, and this is a good time to bring up another image, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is an image from a chapter in the book called The Birds, and it has to do the origin of the Environmental Defense Fund, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And if we can see this image, it's of a baby eagle. And I'm going to let Elena take over a little bit of how, because of a dinner, kind of a random dinner that some people had, This image ended up on the cover of Science magazine. So go ahead and tell us that. How did that end?
It's an interesting story, and it's directly related to the tensions and the struggles that were happening in states in the 1960s, the late 1960s, where local groups of citizens were coming together and saying, okay, how can we curb or stop the use of some of these pesticides, particularly DDT, in our own communities? And on Long Island, there was a group of scientists, some of them at Brookhaven National Labs and Stony Brook University, local high schools, who had gotten together and wrote a letter to the local paper about their county's use of DDT. That letter caught the interest of a local lawyer, and they decided to sue locally to stop the use of DDT. And these were some probably guys in their 30s, young to mid 30s, who found that this approach was really effective. And so they found that by announcing that they were going to sue, the county got so kind of cautious that it sort of backed down. And then this also got a bunch of press. And they started to kind of come up with a formula. Well, if this is going to work here, maybe we can try it elsewhere. Two of the people who were involved in the suit on Long Island then went and helped community groups in Michigan and then Wisconsin file suit. And the group in Wisconsin was called, actually, we'll get to the group in Wisconsin in a second. The group that was from Long Island started to call themselves the Environmental Defense Fund. And as they started to help this group in Wisconsin, they learned that this group was so well connected that they decided to kind of try a few different approaches in Wisconsin to see if one of them was more effective than the other in stopping the use of DDT. What they ended up learning through all their connections was that at the time, Wisconsin state law allowed citizens to petition the state government, and the petition could say, we think that this thing is a pollutant. Can you hold hearings and determine if it is? And so they petitioned the Department of Natural Resources. The department held hearings, and they did what they did on Long Island. They publicized these hearings, and they got a ton of attention, and they got reporters from not just local newspapers and magazines, but national outlets, including Science. And the folks who comprised this new group, Environmental Defense Fund, made a point as the hearings were happening of inviting folks out to dinner and saying, come, we're going to take you out to dinner and tell you all about what we know about the science of how DDT and related chemicals are harming ecosystems. And in one moment in the hearings, they had invited an ornithologist from the University of Wisconsin at Madison to present some of his research. This ornithologist, Joe Hickey, had studied what had happened to the bird populations in a few places in Wisconsin before and after DDT spraying. And he was one of a number of scientists who noticed that two things were happening. One, the chemical was toxic to some birds immediately, and it could cause, particularly at the right dose, immediate die-offs among bird populations. But he also noticed that it had a slightly less acute effect where the birds that took in doses that weren't lethal were still affected by the chemical and were laying thinner eggs as a result. And Hickey, in his testimony in Wisconsin, ended up showing that photo of the eaglet. And he described how this was an eagle that had just hatched in a nest where the egg just adjacent to it was too thin. And for him, it was an illustration of the kind of long-term effects that eggshell thinning could have on bird populations, in addition to the immediate effects. Over dinner, one of these nights out with the folks from EDF and the reporters, the EDF folks, Charlie Worster and Victor Yannicone, were two of the most heavily involved, offered to give them, the reporters, this photo and to grant them the use of it And one of the reporters who was reporting on the hearings for the journal Science ended up taking them up on the offer, putting it on getting it on the cover of Science, and in no time, and this was even before the hearings were done, subscribers everywhere were seeing this really heart-wrenching image of this eaglet almost gesturing to this broken shell in the nest next to it. And it was an extraordinarily effective image.
Is it fair to say that it went the equivalent in 1960 of going viral?
I think that is probably fair to say. Yeah. And this is one of those images that was so hard to ignore at the time. And if you saw it, you were talking about it. Everybody who saw it was talking about it for sure. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that the book includes that is so delicious, but also complicated, is that you include a lot of behind the scenes, a lot of how the sausage is made. And the sausage of regulation was complicated. And I wonder if you want to explain to us, I'm not sure if I should call it the Delaney Amendment.
Yeah.
And maybe the unusual support of tobacco companies that happened at that time.
Yeah, so there's a few threads that end up getting intertwined while all of this is going on. So the folks at EDF won their hearings in Wisconsin. The department ruled that it was a pollutant and recommended that it no longer be used. They won another hearing in Michigan, and then they started getting invited to help file lawsuits all over the place. They also, however, stayed tightly focused on DDT, and within a few years, they decided to petition the USDA and argue that because DDT had shown up in women's breast milk, which was demonstrated by this time, under the Delaney Clause, its use needed to be halted. Now, the Delaney Clause was that 1950s bit of regulation that I mentioned before that said if anything was found to cause cancer in lab animals or people, it was no longer allowed in the food supply. And in the late 60s, some scientists actually in Hungary had carried out some studies using rats where they showed that there was an increasing likelihood of tumors in rats who were fed DDT for subsequent generations. When the folks at EDF found out about this particular study, they began to think, wait a second, then DDT shouldn't be allowed in the food supply under the Delaney Clause, and maybe we can get rid of it that way. And so this was one of the arguments that they made when they filed their petition against the USDA in the very tail end of the 1960s, early 1970. What's interesting is that the Delaney Clause was just at that time starting to come under fire from companies and industries who found that it was actually getting in the way of their ability to do business, because lots of things cause tumors in animals in particular. And keeping all of those out of the food supply was going to mean pulling back on a lot of commonly used chemicals, not just pesticides. So Delaney had a number of foes in the 1960s going into the 1970s. One of them, we're kind of a long way from the tobacco industry still, but I'll kind of get us there. One of them was a consumer group that was created in the late 1970s, the American Council on Science and Health, which was really focused on using its organizational might and the media to undermine public support for the Delaney Clause so that it would ultimately be overturned. Long story short, if we fast forward to the late 90s, actually 1996, the Delaney Clause ended up being undone, removed from the Food and Drug Administration. There's a much more complicated story about why it happened at that moment. But to go back to your question about the tobacco industry, their feelings on DDT are pretty complicated at this time. Around the time that EDF and other community groups are seeking local bans and then seeking to petition the US government to consider pulling back on it, the tobacco industry is facing heat because European nations are passing limits on the amount of DDT allowable in crops that they're importing. And some European, actually, journalists had done independent tests of American cigarettes on the market in Europe, and they found that it contained extraordinarily high levels of DDT. So as the Environmental Defense Fund and other environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society are focused on trying to get DDT effectively banned by the federal government around 1970, at the same time, tobacco companies are starting to get anxious that their product is not going to be able to be sold in Europe. And I think it was Germany and Great Britain combined comprised some 30% of US tobacco exports. So what they started to do is they started to pressure first growers to stop using DDT, and then later regulators, and they started asking USDA to ask growers to stop using DDT. They're very quiet about it, but at the same time, the environmental groups are seeking something. The tobacco industry is seeking the same exact thing. You know, DDT's ban was held up in 1972 when the US federal government, in the form of the EPA, which was newly founded, they ultimately banned DDT in 1972, and the environmental groups claimed it as a victory. But when you kind of scratch the surface and look a little deeper, it becomes clear that there were other interests that wanted to see DDT go too. The tobacco industry was one of them. Chemical companies were another. DDT was not a moneymaker for them anymore by this time. And they were happy to see it go, see farmers stop using it, and then use that as an opportunity to start selling more expensive pesticides, particularly patented ones.
I just want to, I want to bring a little bit of this complicated story to a question about how you came to write this book. We haven't talked about that, why you chose this subject. Do you want to give us a little bit of that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And I realized so a few minutes ago, you had talked about how I described this book in the introduction as a story that unfolds in 3 acts. Act 1, we have this wonder chemical, we embrace it wholeheartedly. Act 2, we ban it. Act 3, we haven't even talked about yet, but Act 3 is this moment later, which we'll get to, around 2000, when people start saying that it's time to bring DDT back. That moment is why I decided to write a whole book about this. As has probably already become clear, there are so many threads and so many complications to DDT's story. And I first became aware of it right around the year 2000. I was a graduate student in public health at the time, and I was attending a conference on global health issues. And at one of the panel discussions, folks at the front of the room, the experts on global health, were talking about malaria, and in particularly how bad malaria had gotten in sub-Saharan Africa, and how it was really important to consider bringing back DDT to combat this disease. As somebody who was in grad school in the year 2000, and I was born roughly a generation before that, and that meant I had grown up hearing about DDT as this extraordinarily toxic chemical that was linked to cancer and that was implicated in the decline of the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the osprey, which once inhabited the place where I grew up and were no longer there. So in the year 2000, I just found myself thinking, why on earth would we bring this chemical back? I know malaria is horrible. Don't we have other tools for combating the disease at this point in time? And the question just sort of stuck with me for a while. Years later, I was introduced to something called the Industry Documents Library, which was a collection of corporate documents from the tobacco industry released in the process of discovery during the suits against the tobacco industry in the 90s. And these documents were collected and digitized by UCSF here in San Francisco. And I was looking through the documents. I had been pointed to them for some other reason, and something just made me plug DDT into the search engine. And then I found the first fascinating thing. The very first thing I came across was the fact that back in the 1940s and 50s, tobacco companies had been studying DDT because they wanted to know how it affected their crop. And they were like, well, it actually makes it kind of sweeter. It affects the burn rate. And so interesting. But later on, I could see that they were becoming skeptical of it. And so that kind of stuck with me. I never really expected there to be a connection between the tobacco industry and DDT. I held on to that for a few more years. The industry documents collection just grew and grew. And a few years later, again, just one of those days when you're doing research and you decide to plug in something random, I plugged in DDT again. And I came across this really curious document from the year 1998. And in it, somebody was describing an idea for a campaign. And the campaign would popularize the idea that it was time to bring DDT back into use, and that the argument for bringing it back would be that it was the best way to control malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. But the point of the campaign wasn't actually to control malaria. The point of the campaign was actually to cause a rift among advocates for the environment and advocates for health. In other words, a rift among liberals and Democrats, to split them and pit them against each other. And in particular, to show the quote unquote hypocrisy of the DDT ban, to show that by banning this chemical in the interests of Western nations like the US, it left poorer nations and impoverished nations in places like sub-Saharan Africa at higher risk of malaria. And this was a campaign proposed by a think tank, a conservative think tank, and ended up being funded by the tobacco industry, which was why it was in the Industry Documents Library. So at this point, I realized there was probably a book to be written, because it meant that there was far more to DDT's story than met the eye. And yeah, that was years ago. Yeah.
Has your opinion changed on whether indeed DDT might have saved lives internationally? I mean,
yeah, that's a really good question. And that was one of the other reasons why writing a book about this also appealed to me, because there are no easy answers in this story. It absolutely saved lives. It absolutely was harmful to wildlife, and it absolutely increased people's risks of actually several different types of cancer. I only mentioned breast cancer. So it had extraordinary benefits and extraordinary costs, and most technologies do.
I wanted to read the audience just one short bit, and this is about Hill and Knowlton is a was at the time large advertising agency. And one of the things I appreciate about the book is that you have a couple of different examples of strategies that you say were repeated over and over again to try to discredit scientists. And this strategy is, it says, Hill designed a campaign that they would tailor for the tobacco industry. Publicists drafted a backgrounder for editors and commentators at national news outlets, giving them the facts. They put top chemical executives on the radio, and they flooded local reporters with press releases. And they pushed out two messages. Chemicals were crucial and chemicals were safe.
Yeah. And this, I have to say, this goes all the way back to the 1950s. They felt really threatened by the congressional hearings about chemical safety held in the early 50s. And that was when they first kind of came up with this set of strategies for defending the chemical industry. And they end up later, Hill and Knowlton does this for the chemical industry. They end up using the same strategies for the tobacco industry. And it's remarkable to read their meeting notes and then go and look at newspapers and see, oh, hey, here's this chemical executive quoted here. Oh, look at this columnist who's saying, like, everything's a chemical, even grandma's canning supplies contain chemicals, and there's nothing to worry about there. And, you know, they really were effective at pushing back against the idea of toxicity. So.
I don't want to let more time go by without inviting you to introduce us to a very different character, not someone from industry and not someone with a formal environmentalist background, but take us to Triana, Alabama, and introduce us to the mayor, Clyde Foster. He did a lot of amazing things.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about Clyde Foster. He's one of these people who's hard to do justice. One of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was give voice to people who weren't usually included in stories about contested technologies. DDT's story has been told before, and it's been told as a story about war and scientists. And I wanted to tell it as a story about people, in particular, people who had really complicated encounters with this chemical. And Clyde Foster was one of them. He was the mayor of Alabama when he first became aware that his town was exposed to DDT through fish in the Tennessee River, which Triana sits right in the bend of the Tennessee River in northeastern Alabama. Foster, to kind of understand Foster, you kind of got to go back in time a little bit. He grew up in poverty, went to college, majored in math, and he met his wife in college, and she was from Triana, and she missed the town deeply and convinced him to move back there with her shortly after they graduated. And one of the draws was the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, which was outside of Huntsville, and Triana was also outside of Huntsville. And he applied for and got a job there as an analyst, and was immediately struck. So this is the late 1950s, early 1960s. He's immediately struck by the extraordinary disconnect between the fact that he's working at a ballistic missile agency while Triana doesn't have running water, doesn't have street lights, doesn't have electricity. And his in-laws, his wife's family, would talk about what an incredible town, what a lively town Triana had once been, and how it used to be like one of the most important shipping ports back in the 19th century. He learned that Triana, by this time, the middle of the 20th century, was unincorporated, but that it had a charter. And so he went to the state archives, dug up the charter, and wanted to get it reinstated. And so he found a judge who would listen to his case. And eventually, after 5 years of trying, he found a judge who said, all right, town's back on the map. You're the mayor. And Clyde Foster, is a Black man, 32 years old, is named the mayor of this town that he had, moved to 5 years ago because of his wife. And then he just threw himself into the improvement of this town. He put in the street lights, electricity, eventually running water, hired a police chief, created jobs, training programs, all while working for an agency and then eventually NASA during the day. So he's mayor by night, weekends. During the day, he ends up working essentially on the Apollo mission that sends astronauts to the moon. And all the while, again, struck by this extraordinary disconnect between what our country is capable of and what his town is living through. He's at work one day in the later 1970s and comes across a news article about extraordinarily high levels of DDT in fish in the Tennessee River. And he puts two and two together. DDT by that time had been banned several years. From what he remembered, it was banned because it was harmful not only to wildlife, but for people too. He was an incredibly effective mayor, and he knew his way around a federal agency. And remarkably, within a week, he had the CDC, the EPA, the TVA coming to Triana, this town of less than 1,000 people, to investigate what had happened. The reason why Triana is in this book is because what the investigators found was that Triana's residents had higher levels of DDT in their body than had been recorded anywhere in the world. That included people who had spent their careers working in DDT factories or spraying DDT for a living. And it was because they were eating fish from the river, as in some cases, people were eating it 6 meals a week. And fish accumulated the chemical in their bodies, and then folks who ate those fish accumulated it in theirs too. The story of Clyde goes on from there, but it was larger than life. And sadly, I learned about him 1 year after he had passed away. So much of what I learned about him, I learned from his daughter, Edith Foster, who was just an incredible resource for me as I was writing.
Well, I thought, before we go to some audience questions, I just want to give you a chance to share some of Clyde's frustration that I don't know if members of the audience remember. There was a lot of news coverage of Love Canal, which was a case of industrial pollution and residents there. And tell us his reaction to how much attention that got versus him trying to get attention for Triana.
Absolutely. I mean, from what I just said, the folks in Triana had every federal agency showing up within a week. But then, as Foster watched the news, Love Canal was unfolding at the same time. He saw them getting attention from the president. He saw them getting moved out of their homes. He saw them taking members of the EPA hostage. And he just concluded, this is just flat out racism. There's only one reason that everybody in the country knows about Love Canal and doesn't know about Triana. It's because we're Black, and Triana was about 98% Black. This ended up leading him, among others in the town, to wonder if they had been deliberately exposed. And as Foster looked into the history of the DDT contamination, what he learned was actually the Army had long known that DDT was making its way into the river. And he became extraordinarily, I mean, frustrated is not the word. He was furious, absolutely furious when he learned that. There's so much more to say about Clyde Foster.
Oh, but
thank you so much for asking that question. Yeah.
I want to begin asking a couple of questions. So one of the listeners is wondering how you wrote this book while also doing all the other things. I know you received some grant money, is that true, to support you writing the book? Or
Yeah. I mean, when you I guess those of us who teach and work at universities know that you've just got to find a system for doing it all. And I did have a sabbatical. So I had the benefit of a sabbatical semester. I had the benefit of a year actually that I spent at the Science History Institute, which was a year that I just devoted to research. And that was actually back in 2015, 2016. That research I just carried with me for the next 5 years until I could find another sabbatical semester. And I used that semester to try to pull this entire thing together, all of these things that I had learned in that year and then in the follow-up research afterwards. That's probably not a very satisfying answer, but
Well, that's okay.
time management is the answer, I guess. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to ask you, we're living in such a strange pandemic environment, and I think we talked a little bit about this, but I'd love to hear you talk about how writing this book and seeing the interplay of sort of industry and regulatory and science, how does it feel to you to watch what's unfolding about masking or not masking? What's unfolding about the choice not to make COVID vaccination part of regular routine school vaccination? I mean, maybe give an example of something that you see differently because of writing this book.
Sure. I think it was mentioned in the intro, I published a book in 2015, Vaccine Nation. And so I've thought and written quite a lot about vaccination. But without going into detail on that, there are quite a few ways in which writing this book during the pandemic was a really almost kind of eerie experience at times. Early in the pandemic, I was researching and writing about DDT's use against epidemic polio. And this takes us all the way back to the very first question about the cover, because one of the main reasons why TIFA was so effective at selling smoke screens to communities, to cities, counties, etc., was because they argued that it was a really good way to kill the flies that were spreading polio. Because at the time, polio was this terrifying epidemic disease. In the 1940s, it was coming back summer after summer after summer. It affected mostly children. It was paralyzing. In the worst cases, people could end up paralyzed for life. Actually, I guess in the worst cases, it was fatal. And it could also be permanently paralyzing in some cases from the neck down. And there were loads of theories about how polio was transmitted in the 1940s. And one of the popular ones was that flies were transmitting it from filthy environments and transmitting it from those environments to vulnerable children. And so TIFA and then DDT manufacturers end up getting on board with this too. They all touted their wares as ways of preventing polio. And I knew that it wasn't effective. I mean, it killed flies. It killed a lot of flies. It also bred a lot of resistance among flies. And it was tested as a means of stopping polio in 1945, 46, 47, 48. And the studies kept showing it doesn't work. And yet people kept spraying their communities with DDT to stop polio into the early 1950s. So early in the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, I knew we were in a similar moment, a moment of panic, and we were willing and kind of desperate to try whatever seemed worth doing, whatever seemed like it was going to work at the moment. And I remember in the beginning, going to the grocery store and people wearing masks, people wearing gloves, people were sanitizing and wiping down their groceries. And, there were lots of things that we did at the beginning that we ended up dropping soon after. There may still be things that we're doing now that we may end up finding out, 10 years down the line. Maybe that wasn't the best way to manage COVID. Studying that history of polio and DDT was just a real reminder of how we move through epidemics and fits and starts, and we move with the guidance and aid of science, but also with a kind of desperation and speed and haste. And this too goes back to the early days of DDT. It was a war chemical, and its benefits outweighed its risks during the war. And outside of the war, that risk benefit calculation changed again, and changed again. So, yeah.
I was struck by your description of what you called the fundamental fracture in the way the agencies all are responsible and responding. And that seemed to me to parallel some of the complications of communication from the federal government during this pandemic. And I was curious whether you think the FDA and the CDC have a smoother, more efficient. Are they more efficient now than they were in Chapter 9?
Well, that's probably, as an outsider, I would say I might defer to folks who are on the inside. But then again, as an outsider, I probably have a better look at or view of what that looks like over time. The thing about the CDC, its toxicology division in the 40s, the late 40s and early 50s, it was so small. Because it was small, it was efficient. But because it was small, it was also just under the exclusive control of, in particular, one scientist who really thought that he knew all there was to know about toxicity and toxicology, and who had pretty significant sway over the field, and in particular over how toxicity of pesticides was understood for a while. So efficiency has its trade-offs. I think you could, on the one hand, say, for instance, the CDC had some more efficient divisions back then, but that certainly had its costs too.
Well, you have given us all a lot to think about. I just want to invite people listening, Elena has graciously said that if you have a question and you didn't get a chance to ask that question, you could find her on Twitter at Elena Conis and ask the question, and we can all read the answer.
Thanks so much, Sally. Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm happy to have conversations with folks. I think the thing about DDT's history, which we didn't even get to, is that, yeah, there was this move to, quote, bring it back 20 years ago. But as I was writing this book, it actually sort of came back. There was a discovery of an enormous cache of barrels dumped by a DDT manufacturer back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this cache is off the Southern California coast in the Pacific. And over the last year and a half, the extent of it was just begun to be documented, at the same time that a whole bunch of research looking at cancer in sea lions has actually found a really concerning role. The higher a sea lion's body burden of DDT, that actually increases its risk of a kind of cancer that's been prevalent among the sea lions if they're also simultaneously affected with a herpes virus that they're susceptible to. So all this is to say is there are ways in which DDT actually is coming back at this moment. And I think that the discovery of this cache is just one tiny example of where it still rests in our environment that we're not even aware of. I know that was grim. Sorry. Yeah.
If we don't have, I promise we won't show you a picture of a sick sea lion, but maybe some of you did see the headlines about these barrels of DDT were purposely dumped in the ocean at a certain distance from land, because at the time the idea was, and it's hard to believe that that was an idea, that they wouldn't pose any risk. And some of them are at an extreme depth in the ocean. But because DDT is, mammals retain it in their fat. So the higher you are as a predator, the more you consume it in other animals, and then it stays with you. So I believe that's one of the reasons that the sea lions are
Absolutely. Yeah,
suffering.
it is. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's worth also mentioning ocean dumping was legal when it was done. So yeah, we make mistakes and hopefully we learn from them.
Yeah, I think ocean dumping was legal, but I also believe that some of the exploration that they're doing is revealing that there might have been, so you might have put 1,000 barrels on a barge and you had the permission for 1,000 barrels,
Right.
but you ended up dumping 2,000 or 3,000 instead.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you were permitted to dump it over here, but then you ended up dumping it over there. And maybe some of it wasn't even in barrels. I think there's a lot, yeah, that remains to be discovered if we even discover it at this point.
How safe is Triana, Alabama now?
So the EPA published its, I think it was its 6th 5-year report of the cleanup last year, 2021. And they found finally at that time that all of the fish in the Tennessee that they had been monitoring for their DDT levels had finally come down to the target level that they set for those fish and for the cleanup effort back in the early 1980s. So fishing reopened several years ago, and the levels are supposedly at target, although I think that the cleanup agreement said they have to stay that low for a few more years. So we're not quite there yet. There are other layers to this too, which is that the levels that were set as the target safe levels back in 1981 now look like they may not have been low enough. And the most recent EPA report hinted at that. And it's not clear what that means, whether the cleanup will continue or not. But the river is beautiful. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to travel there, which I had planned to do in the summer of 2020, but the pictures that Clyde's daughter in particular shared with me show an absolutely serene and beautiful place with a trail named after Clyde Foster too.
Oh, what a nice thing. I'm now wondering about the mayor. I'm wondering who is the mayor of Triana, and we're going to send him a copy of this book.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And yes, she is aware of it. And yeah, it's on my list to send her a copy right away.
One of the things I also want people to realize, if there's any question we didn't answer, you have a wonderful, almost, I mean, I could call it a big bibliography, but it's really the notes for each chapter have all sorts of scientific resources for every, the majority of what's contained in each chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to make sure that everything was absolutely transparent. So it's all there.
Yeah, I would say your acknowledgements take up easily 30 pages. It might be even more than that.
Oh no, the acknowledgements are only a couple pages, but they precede a very long section of sources.
Oh, okay.
Probably are 30 pages. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the other thing that I guess I would like to point out about that is that there are so many incredible archivists and librarians who just so graciously sent me materials during the pandemic as they were able to get into their libraries even when they were closed. And they're just an incredible resource for writers everywhere.
I can ask more questions, or it might almost be time for us to wrap up. I want to give you a chance to say what Act 3 really, your elevator summary of that.
Absolutely. Act 3 is so interesting because this is the act where all of a sudden news reporters, journalists, television anchors started saying it's time to bring back DDT. And this goes back to that discovery in the archives, in the industry documents library, where I had seen that document saying, let's create a campaign to convince people to bring back DDT. What I found was right around the year 2000, the few years leading up to it, there was a move for a global convention, a global agreement to phase out the use of what were called the persistent organic pollutants. These were chemicals, DDT was on the list, that once used and once they were in the environment, persisted in the environment for an incredibly long time, and either had an extraordinarily long half-life or were otherwise resistant to breakdown. And this global convention was drawn up by delegates who came from hundreds of countries and were meeting on an annual basis for several years in a row, figuring out a plan for how to phase out all of these chemicals. And then when they got to DDT, it all got extraordinarily complicated. There were folks who had signed a letter saying we can't class DDT with the rest of these persistent chemicals because we need it for malaria and we need to include a DDT exception. And then behind the scenes, there was this tobacco industry funded campaign to keep this controversy alive, keep it front and center as a way of undermining public support for Western-led public health ideas and campaigns, but also undermining support, and this is where things get complicated, for two other global treaties that were just being considered to regulate tobacco on a global level too. So the reason why the tobacco industry was interested in funding this Bring Back DDT campaign was because they saw it as a way to kind of throw Western nations' leadership in public health into question, and at the same time distract people's attention from the hazards of cigarette smoke firsthand and secondhand, and focus it instead on something like malaria. So this was the very, very, very messy Act 3, where you have all of these different actors who are in some ways saying the same thing, but for incredibly different reasons. And it becomes almost impossible to figure out what the truth is and what's spin.
Well, I recommend this book because it has that, the dizzying reality that you can't tell exactly where there is. Just as you said.
Yeah.
And I have to bring us to a close here, but I want to thank you so much for being part of this, and hope to meet you in real life at some point when you can come to Seattle.
Thank you, Sally. I appreciate your time. This was great. Pleasure talking about the book with you.
Yes, Sally, thank you so much for leading this conversation. And Elena, what a joy it was to have you in Seattle. And one day we'll have you in person, but we'll take this for now. And I'm sure our audience enjoyed it just as much. And to my friends who are watching, please remember to pick up a book. And that link can be found in the chat from Bold Type Books. So thank you both so much. And everyone, have a great night.
Thank you.